Hello, I'm Royal Orr. Welcome to the second in our special Epiphany series, starting off 2025, the year in which we will mark the centennial of the founding of the United Church of Canada. This week, we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive into issues involving Indigenous people and the relationship between the United Church over the century with those nations across this country. We've got a couple of special guests in addition to John, who is our technical wizard here, and Brian, who is the producer of this series for us. We're very pleased to be joined by the Reverend Kimberly Roy. She's served in the past as the National Indigenous Council co-chair. She continues with the work on the National Indigenous Council, a long-time leader within the United Church with many roles, and currently the minister of the Goodfish Lake Indigenous Congregation in Alberta, northeast of Edmonton. Welcome, Kimberly. Good to have you with us on the series.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
So before we dig into some issues, again, because I think the reality of Indigenous communities and the Indigenous community may be a little bit far away from people, could you just talk a little bit about your community of faith at Goodfish Lake?
So currently I serve Good as supply because they are remote and because there's not very many ministers to serve all of the ministries that we have in the United Church of Canada, never mind the Indigenous ministries who are remote and or on reserve and in places that isn't always safe. So Indigenous ministries is a very different way of being in ministry than it is in other churches. It can be in the same. There's also so much more. The richness, the tradition, the old tradition, and the wisdom that is transferred from the elders is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit more about that place. Now, Goodfish Lake, as I understand from the internet, is part of the Whitefish Lake First Nation, which is allied with the Saddle Creek Lake Cree Nation. Sort of what's the community like? What's the landscape like?
So it's a very rich for caring for each other, loving each other, and being a part of community. They thrive to have church. It's amazing. I was there one Sunday. I don't get to go often, once a month at the most, because what happens is, for me, it's 6 hours away, both ways. Wow. And then getting the church set up. And so to get ready for church is a day, to get to church is a day, to leave church is a day. It's quite the thing. Saddle Lake had their own United Church, and unfortunately never got to preach there. And they've decided that they didn't have support after COVID, and they have since closed. On the reserve, though, any week there's several deaths and elders all the time. So oftentimes we sit before church and they name the people who've passed since the last time I was there. And the graveyard is right drive into the churchyard, and you can see the obvious sign. There's so much devastation and sadness on the reserve. So it is a place that is wanting church. When I was there one Sunday and I asked them, can we do some PowerPoints? So they have a projector now. We don't have internet, so I'm still struggling on using technology, but we got Carmen's Christmas and Advent, what she had to say. So that was amazing for them to have. And so after church, I asked them, how often do you want church? Because we're looking at to Zoom other churches in or some kind of technology. And the two fellows stood up in the back and said, we want church every Sunday. Mm-hmm. Can you tell the church? We want church today. And so it's there's not normally over 10 people, but these people are thriving for church. They want church.
Right. Royal, I'd like to mention that I'm Brian Brown. I would like to mention that Kimberly's church, or the Goodfish Church, is one of the hosts of a cluster, and they are inviting in June the congregations in Two Hills, St. Paul, Alberta, Bonneville, Alberta, and Cold Lake, Alberta, and those folks are getting kind of excited about being present uh, for a service at Good Fish Lake with those good people.
That's good information. Now, Good Fish Lake, I understand, is
Yeah.
Cree language, but you Kimberly, you're Métis, right? Alberta Métis. And can you talk maybe a little bit about your own path, how you have reached this point where you are so active in the National Church, both the General Council and the National Indigenous Council, but also still an active minister? How did you end up in this space?
So I live on the historic Métis settlement of Marlborough that is halfway between Edmonton and Jasper in Alberta. And 5 generations of my family have lived on that land and lived off that land and farmed and been a part of. My mom's family is Cree and my dad's family is first generation from Denmark. So
Wow.
we were always people in that area, Métis folks, and there's a lot of Métis folks that are there, but we grew up with the same traditions and many of the same stories. Sometimes it looks different, sometimes it doesn't look different. And so many years ago, before I started ministry, I actually applied to the Sandy Soto Center. And at the time they said I was too white. And so it was interesting because they've come so far now that I went into ministry. I become a diaconal minister, and I'd always wanted to be an ordained minister. That was the path, but at the time I couldn't take that path. And now I've gone back to the Sandy Soto Center, and I'm going to be ordained through the Sandy Center. It's been an interesting journey, and it will continue to be as I discover my roots. It's interesting because if you could take me and take my layers off, you would see that underneath my whiteness, we live off the land. We are people of the land and balance that. So it's quite an interesting story as it goes. With the National Indigenous Council, right now there isn't one. And so I'm past co-council chair. And we're hoping that in time coming that there will be a new National Indigenous Council.
Can you maybe just bring us again, and this speaks to realities of the church that are realities that some of us may regret, but we don't have a good sense of what's going on with all. I mean, many of us have heard there is a move towards an Indigenous church within the United Church. I think most of us are aware that there's a pretty intense history in the last 30, 40 years of trying to come up with a structure for right relationship within the church between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So where are we with this? As I said to you earlier, maybe people had a sense when the remit was happening about an Indigenous church, maybe even participated in the discussions that this was going on. But where are we with the Indigenous church in the United Church right now?
So I'll start with when I was flying back to Edmonton, the Archbishop of the Indigenous Church for the Anglican Church in Canada, and I had a great conversation. And because there is so much going on in the Indigenous Church right now, since last April, we haven't had a National Indigenous Council because of that has been meeting because of breakdown of relationship. And so our hope is that as relationships repair, that we will have a council again that will lead the Indigenous people. So in November, December of 2024, there was a meeting, a National Indigenous Council meeting was at, and so was Michael Blair and Carmen, and many of the people who were on the past National Indigenous Council and elders. And we were talking about how it is that we want to move forward in a good way, and that looks like, and what we need to do to get there. So the Archbishop, him and I had a great conversation in the Edmonton airport, and he says, it just takes time. It takes so much time because there's so many people who've had so many hurt feelings that we need to find the places of commonality and to be able to move forward from there. And so it brings me to when I was first speaking with the elders at Good Fish about this. 100th anniversary, I want to call it the party bus, because I see everyone wanting to get on the party bus and celebrate 100 years of the church. It was just like a great birthday and anniversary, like everyone wants to. But one must think that 100 years ago, what was happening to Indigenous people with church and state? And so when I was talking with the elders about that, I said, so how do we move forward in a good way that keeps everyone's dignity intact, and we can learn from this and have a great experience? Because really, we're not going to be on the party bus, but we might be somewhere in between, right? So
Yeah.
they are very happy and excited to be able to host this event. They've reached out with other United Churches in other ways, and I think that this is a pinnacle moment for Good Fish United Church to be involved. But we do need to realize we're talking about people who are in their 70s and 80s. There's a few young folks, but the young folks, because church hasn't been there for a while, and they've been kind of left alone for a while, that it takes time to build up again.
Right. Well, one person who's done a lot to try and make sure that people in the United Church understand that these issues are important and give some extensive background about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous is Brian Arthur Brown, especially in his most recent book, The Untied Church. And we just wanted to turn to that for a moment. But just before I do, I just want to note that Kimberly is joining us from a place where the internet is not great. So the audio is always solid from my perspective and to my ear, even though the image sometimes is a little bit difficult. But can we maybe turn to that? Because Kim, I think you would join me in sort of celebrating that Brian took the initiative to put this together. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there. And I thought maybe I'd kind of turn it over to the two of you just to dig in a little bit to some of the content of the Untied Church on this range of issues with Indigenous people within our framework. So I think there's a reading you might want to start with, right, Kim?
Now, there's a reading that Kim should give us. It's in the book. It's a paragraph by Laurie Ransom, and Laurie is another great Indigenous animator. She calls herself, or is called, and I'd love to hear that from Kim.
Yes, and I will preface this with, this is a beautiful piece of Indigenous art in my heart. And it's great. So please listen to this with your heart. Close your minds if you can. Close your eyes if you can, because I think you may hear this differently. God was present in our land and among our peoples before the colonizers arrived. When Christians brought the Bible to us, we recognized the voice of our Creator in Jesus' teachings. But we did not hear all call to reject our identities. We heard God loves us. God loves our cultures and our languages and our spiritualities. God knows us and God loves us as spiritual beings with all of creation. Our culture, languages which uphold our houses for well-being. Laurie Ransom.
Well, thank you. And I know of all the things in this book, the Untied Church, which is not the United Church, it's not a misspelling. It's the Untied Church of Canada book. That paragraph by Laurie Ransom is being used in Presbyterian, Catholic, and Anglican conversations as well. It's right to the heart of the matter in many respects. I'd like to come back just for a second to the structures between our relations, because this paragraph that she read calls for us to have both together. It's not either or, and so. I have Indigenous friends who have been saying to me that the new Indigenous church within the United Church might be similar to the regional councils across the church. Others are saying, no, it's more than that, more autonomy than even the regional councils. But that's one way of possibly looking at that structure. But to get into the structure that there's more, even in Christianity in the early days in this country, that we don't yet have a grasp of, and people like Kimberly are helping us, but we still have way to go. The only early missionary that used indigenous framework for his work was Jean Brebeuf, of course. Twas in the lodge of broken bark a tender babe was born, and that was an attempt to tell the story in the indigenous context. But there's something similar could have happened with when the Catholic. I'm going to read a little bit from this because it's so important to get this across. Something similar could have happened when the Catholic priest Albert Lacombe and our own missionaries and children reached the foothills of the Rockies, a divinely inspired opportunity for them to experience the ways of Christ in the Canadian context and to adopt them on their arrival in the Rockies. They found as revealed to them by the nation of Jesus Christ, Jesu Christ, who had been introduced to them by their prophet and seer, whose name was Beanie. Indigenous members of Beanie's church told missionaries of angels and those told about him. The cross was the symbol of the tribe who had learned the importance of loving each other and stories about loving their enemies. They celebrated a weekly Dimos, obviously a corruption of the French Dimanche Sunday, but they also followed the strict Scottish Métis manner of Sabbath observance. Beanie had been a young shaman, a spiritual leader before any white traders or settlers or missionaries reached the Rockies. And according to the story, after failing in a resurrection context with the arrival, Beanie appeared to have died and somehow disappeared, though the tribe found his clothing up a tree. A year and a half later, his dead body fell from the tree, and on the third day he revived, singing a hymn, Ha-hi nahi nanawanatiya kenahe, which they all learned and could still sing for the missionaries. And our Methodist missionaries wrote it down. And with the help of Alberta's Lieutenant Governor Ralph Steiner, who's an Indigenous United Church elder who knew the story, our church historian, Jerry Hutcherson, tried to get the phrase translated but failed. And I learned the details from him when he had a research station in the basement of our Manson Medicine Hat. But the information was more recently recounted from another source in the 2013 Wonder Cafe program of the United Church. But just to make it live, the missionaries wrote down quotes from Beanie, and I'm going to ask if, in fact, Kimberly would read us a little further, more direct quotes. Pick it up from there, Rini. It's right after Beanie, right after his resurrection. Into it, please.
So the top of page 72, correct?
Yes, 72.
Okay. Beanie touched his forehead with his right hand, then touched each shoulder and his breast. Everyone in the crowd imitated him in making the signs of the cross, and Beanie began to teach them. I saw the son of Zizikri, who stands next to the old man among the sky Manitus, and holds a tree cross and a bowl of water. This is what the Manitou Zizikri told me. Very soon a great plague shall visit your people. The earth shall crumble to pieces and fire shall leap out from the ground. The big sky monster shall swallow the sun, the darkness and smoke shall go and tell your people they are sinners, they are nothing of my cross. They do not marry in the proper way, and they die and are hung in trees. Then Zikri poured the water of baptism onto my head, and he said, Bini, mind over all, shall be your name, for all you are the first of your people discover who I am. You must go down the sky ladder and return to earth to save your tribe and all the tribes that welcome the truth. Baptism and people, give them new names, tell them to be sorry and way. And I traveled all sky around. I stood in the four directions and learned the new way of life. I sang the song, The Old Man, which the song was, Hahi, Hahini, Baha, Tuja, Tasnihai. This is the time for me to return to you, my people. For many days, the people on the tribe and the other tribe to be baptized, to share the miracle, and he taught them the message of Zikri. You shall not kill, you shall not lie, you shall not steal, men shall not have more than one wife. You shall bring the song of life to the celebration of Damas from the sky. The first was the white cloth for which he wore when he was preaching. The second was a small broad board with many signs, including 7 notches to measure the days between Damases, so they could for 6 days and rest for the 7th. He called these scripture signs. The third was a small spruce tree carved in a cross to be held before ceremony dances.
Okay,
That's
so
fine.
that's really interesting, and I wonder why it is that within the church we haven't heard this story more widely. It really is
Yeah.
quite an amazing thing.
We
But there,
weren't ready. We
there,
weren't ready to hear it until now.
maybe
We
we
weren't
weren't
ready.
ready to hear. But
Yeah, that's right.
could I just turn to Kim for a moment, just to kind of wrap up our conversation here, because this has been
Yep.
very rich, especially with that story about Beanie. But Kim, what do you see looking to the next century? What are your hopes and your expectations in terms of whether we can find the path of right relationship in the next 100 years?
So it's interesting. I think we can. I think there's a lot of fear, misunderstanding, and it goes to tradition. So when one of the questions in here was, how can you reconcile traditional life and spirituality? And one of the things that I think people need to really understand about Indigenous people is that we believe we're spirit first, and so we believe we are part of all creation. And it's not unlike Christians who believe that in many ways too. But if we're talking about Indigenous people, we are with creation. We are a part of the balance or the imbalance. We are a part of all of what spirituality means. That's how we live. That's how we walk. That's how we follow Jesus. And so separating them is like taking my heart and putting it over here and my liver over here. So my spirituality is one with my tradition. And so when people ask me, so you different in a traditional Indigenous service, it's just like United Church Services. If you go downtown Timothy Eaton and you go to Dawson Creek, BC, it's going to be very different services because it serves very different people. So my Indigenous services, if you want to call it's about creation. It's about the harmony and balance. It's about healing, and it's about being with people on their spiritual path, because there's so much hurt and pain right now. But I do think we can get there. I think as a church, we are only steps away from being able to understand each other. And I think if we can learn how to be in relationship, then we can learn to be in church together. Until we are in relationship and we allow each other to be each other and who they are, I don't think can happen. But I think we are on path.
Reverend Kimberly Roy, thank you so much for being with us for this second session in our Epiphany series. Kimberly Roy has served as co-chair of the National Indigenous Council. She's currently a member of the General Council Executive, and she serves the people of Good Fish Lake in the Indigenous community of faith there. We've also got another little reflection about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And Brian, can you set this up from our much loved former moderator, David Giuliano?
Sure. And one of the reasons that we wanted David Giuliano to do this is that he's going to be doing this again and in a leading way in one of the cluster services in June. And this is all in anticipation of that. But when Kimberly was reading at the about Beanie, her voice broke up a couple of times. Two of the times were the emphasis on baptism into Christ, and Beanie was very into this. And so on in the Indigenous context. And so at an earlier conversation with Kimberly, she was telling me that it is in fact Jesus that is going to be the bridge. Jesus is the Christ. And in the anniversary, we are celebrating not just the church, we are celebrating Christ. And that's the emphasis of David Giuliano. And David Giuliano is not only a great preacher, but like the wounded healer, David Giuliano was had cancer before becoming moderator and got over it. Had cancer again during his time as moderator and got over it. And after being moderator, got cancer a third time. And so you can see the ravages on his body when you meet him in half a second. And he is suggesting that Christ for Indigenous and for everybody else, this is the thing that we need to be celebrating. One of the things that we'll be celebrating bigly in June. So let's just hear from David Giuliano. It's been pre-recorded from something he said to the last General Council, and it's going to be similar to what he's going to give us in June, but we want a foretaste. Let's go.
Well, what a gift it is to be invited to reflect a little bit with folks at General Council on who Jesus is to me. Who do I say that he is? And I guess the first thing that pops into my mind is Jesus is simply the path that has chosen me. I didn't have a lot of say in it. I grew up in the church, and I had a say in it as I got older, but I have been on that journey for 62 years. The other thing I'd say is that the way I would describe him at this point in my life is that he is the embodiment of the divine. In other words, he is embodying for us the divine in ways that help us to understand how to embody the divine in ourselves. But I wanted to talk more directly about how I've known Jesus and the places I have known Jesus, and many places and ways. But primarily I've known Jesus in resurrection and in suffering, and that the two are inseparable in my mind. And I think about the story of Doubting Thomas. We all know Doubting Thomas. I always think, I want to say poor Doubting Thomas, because he gets a bad rap. The story is that the disciples were off and they ran into, or Thomas was out and they ran into the resurrected Jesus 3 days after the crucifixion. And they told Thomas about it. He said, "I won't believe it until I see the nails in his hand, the holes in his hands, and put my hand in his side." And, all through the Gospel of John, seeing is believing. It's like a scientific formula almost. People see and then they believe. So, Thomas is in keeping with that. But more importantly, I think that what Thomas doubted was not the resurrection, but was the wounds. After all, Jesus had told him and the other disciples a number of times that he was going to be crucified, and on the third day he would rise. The writer of the Gospel of John makes a point that Thomas was there when Lazarus was raised from the dead. So he's seen someone raised from the dead already. And there's also this sense that there were others in that time in history who had been claimed to have been raised from the dead. So it isn't, to me, the resurrection he has a hard time believing. And the clue is when he says, I won't believe it until I see the holes in his hands made by the nails and place my hand in his side. He didn't say, I won't believe it till I see Jesus up walking or talking or eating or laughing. I won't believe it till I see the wounds. And so I've always understood that to mean that Thomas struggled with the idea that the resurrection could include the woundedness. And I think a lot of us worry about that or wonder about that at times, that we see woundedness and suffering as somehow not part of who Jesus is, and the resurrection as who the ultimate Jesus is. And I guess when I think about how I've known Jesus in new life, but I've also known Jesus in suffering, not my own in small ways, certainly in the point we're at in the history of the church, and even more in the world, where in the midst of great suffering, there is also often new life. And so that's one of the ways that I have known Jesus. And I thank you for the opportunity to share it with you.
Okay. Can I just wind that up, Royal? Okay. So right from Beanie, one of the great Christian saints of Canada, right from Beanie down to David Giuliano, the emphasis is on Christ. And that's what we celebrate most of all in our celebrations. And it's the key to what Kimberly was pointing to us. How do we be in relationship and so on? And the relationship that we're going to be sharing at Goodfish Lake, settler congregations and the Indigenous congregation and so on. But the focus is on Christ. I want to thank our host, of course. Royal Orr does such a job of helping us dig down. I want to thank Kim, of course, and she's wonderful, doing so much in the church. John Bedell, John, we won't ask you to do a pre-recording like we did with David Giuliano again. That too was a little bit choppy, and so likewise with Kim. We apologize to our viewers for some of the technical difficulties. And John, you managed to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear in terms of some of our technical difficulties and so on. So thank you, John. Some of the people who are watching, and from judging from last week, we have probably about 100 individuals, and it looks like 100 groups in church basements and halls and so on, watching together and going into other discussions afterward. And they've been asking for where to focus the discussion. And I'm going to suggest chapter 4, a little bit more about Jesus and about the cross. It's rather ecumenical, but nevertheless, have a look at that if that's what you want to be doing next. Next week, we'll be looking at the resolution of the United Church to become a multicultural church, not just Francophone and Indigenous, but all kinds of other things as well. And we'll have guests from the African diaspora in Canada, from the Chinese diaspora in Canada, both with their own congregations, and also from a mixed race congregation in which there's a lot of mix and so on. And they're going to help us know how that works and how to celebrate that. And so we'll see you then.